What's up, everyone? Well, lately I've been thinking a lot about propagation techniques, and so today I'm going to take this old juniper and see what I can make out of it. I actually purchased this to use as propagation stock mostly, but there's no reason to waste a good old trunk. But the two the two kind of V-shaped trunks here really don't work for me. So there's a number of things that are wrong. You can have a V-shaped trunk, but these two trunks are almost exactly the same size, and that means that they're not going to, absent me using growing techniques to get one of them bigger, they're not going to be really good for something like a father-daughter or mother-daughter kind of composition. Traditionally in bonsai, one of the trunks would be significantly smaller than the other. And so I could play with the height, I could really kind of head in that direction, but I think I'm going to head in an entirely different direction, which is to look at individual parts of this plant and see what I can do with them if I air layer them off. So the first step is going to be just like any other work on a plant like this, which is basically to just get in here and clear out enough space so that I can see what's going on with the structure, with the major woody pieces of the tree. All right, thinning complete for now, and the next step is basically to is to analyze each one of these spots where there are branches coming out and decide, okay, how big of a tree do I want to make, and what are the various options. So I'm going to sit here and kind of contemplate that, drink some coffee with my mug that I got from Itsuko Brahm, who's one of our potters, and try to figure out exactly what the best use of this material is. Something about breaking old stubs off of junipers that's kind of satisfying, although every time I do it, I'm creating another kind of pokey bit that can come back and haunt me later. But looking at the cuts kind of distracts me from being able to analyze the plant fully, so getting rid of them is slightly productive. All right, contemplation complete, I think. There's just not a whole lot of movement. There's not a whole lot of shape in any of the parts of this plant. And so I'm just going to kind of treat this almost like a practice run for using the same techniques on other material, and at the same time still concentrate on layering off parts that are not useful as part of this composition but might be useful in, as separate compositions. And so as I'm doing that, what I've figured out here, let me spin it around. So what I've kind of figured out is that there's so this branch is about the size of my index finger, and that, in order to get that much wood in something that I've propagated from a cutting, I'm going to have to wait at least 3 or 4 years and have a lot of growth. So if I can take this piece of wood with these little tight branches that are right here on it, I can create a small tree from it, maybe even a mame sized tree, with a decent sized trunk a little bit more quickly than I would be able to do with a regular cutting and then wiring method. Now, the downside is that this is basically straight and there's not really any movement to speak of here. There's a little bit down here, but there's no foliage down there to work with in terms of driving the layer. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to layer off this part because it also doesn't really work as part of the base composition here. Now, as opposed to maple air layers, which I demonstrated recently, I am not going to strip off the bark here, and I've tried that a few times with junipers, usually to bad results. And so instead of stripping the bark, I'm actually just going to take this wire, this aluminum wire, and I'm going to girdle the branch by wrapping it tightly around here. And I'm going to use a pair of pliers to really tighten it down, kind of as tight as I can get without breaking the wire, which would definitely break before anything else happens. All right, so I can see that the wire is starting to bulge right there, which means that it's on its way to breaking. And that will be the base of one of my air layers. It also gives me plenty of room here to attach something to hold the soil that I'll need to put around this. One of the interesting things about these old junipers is if you look carefully, you can see these little bumps on the bark. And it seems like those bumps are kind of like dormant buds. And what I've seen in the past doing air layers, so there's a couple of them right here, is that issuing, as soon as you get them wet, basically, as soon as you keep them moist for consistently moist for a while, those little bumps will start issuing roots. And then basically once you have a couple of roots, you can just saw this off and your air layer is done. So just like the other low branch, this one is relatively straight. And unlike that one, there's just not a whole lot going on here that's really very interesting. So I'm actually just going to air layer it right here. And again, it's not because I think it's going to make a fantastic tree, but this size wood with foliage this tight actually can make a decent size composition. And that will just sort of be a different starting point than what you would have if you started from a cutting and started wiring. All right, so that's 2. Let's see how many more we can find. Just to give you guys kind of an eye into the rest of the parts that I think are interesting, I don't find anything redeeming about this whole section here. So I'm probably going to do like an air layer up here. This section has a little bit of movement, and I actually think it could be a decent tree, like a small to medium size tree with a relatively straight trunk. One of the layers here is all this back stuff, but there's some small branching here that I can use for finished composition. So I'm going to leave that alone. That will eventually just be the trunk, and this will be removed to become deadwood so that you have a base here with some taper on it. And then I can use these to create more branching. Above that point is where I need to look for my next layer point, and I'm going to look right up in here. All right, so here we are, just above the section that I think is usable as on the roots that are already here. And this section, I've just kind of split out some deadwood here and made this shari. So anytime you have a shari on a juniper, you should expect obviously that there is not going to be the potential for roots forming because the cambium has been removed, so there's no growing portion here anymore. But I can still get roots right next to that here and here. And in fact, there's those little bumps that I was talking about earlier right there. So I'm gonna wrap a piece of wire right around here and use that as my next air layer point. So as I'm doing this, I'm pulling on the wire while I hold the branch in place and twisting it until I see the wire start to stress, kind of almost like the surface of the wire starts to look a little bit different as it stretches, and that's the point right before it would break. And I would expect there's like 1, 2, 3, at least 3 little bumps right there, and a couple of them over here as well. Now, one of the things that I haven't done before, and I'm going to give it a try here, is stacking air layers. And what I mean by stacking is that here's the one that I just did, and as I move up here, there are other potential spots that I might find useful to air layer. In fact, I mean, part of the problem here is that on a juniper, you don't want to have flush cuts. And so I have to think about, well, how much of this wood do I need just for deadwood if all of this is going to be part of the composition, or maybe it's going to be a little bit taller than that, and these guys are going to be part of the composition as well. Otherwise, I might just air layer it right here. I think I'm going to move up further into the top of the tree. All right, so here's another section. My previous one is about 10 inches below this, and so I'm going to girdle this right here above these branches, but below those. There's a bit of a swell here, which I think actually will make a good base for a juniper with some interesting deadwood, and so basically just planting on roots coming out somewhere in that area could make for an interesting composition. All right, so similar junction here where there's a bunch of branches all coming out of one spot. A lot of these are too big and long to really be using as a small composition. I'm not going to take those off because the more foliage I have up here, the faster the layer will issue roots once the resources that the foliage is creating start pooling here above where I'm going to apply the wire. So I'm going to put a wire right here, and that will be the only air layer on this section of the tree. And there's that same junction from the other side. You can see I've just sort of tightly wrapped it around there, and I'm hoping for roots to come out just above that wire, and I'll wrap the plastic and sphagnum that I'm about to put onto these guys down below that as well. All right, so I have all 5 containers on here, and somehow this is starting to look like a tree house or something like that. But anyway, I put sphagnum in the bottoms of each one of these containers because they have sort of a mesh bottom, which would mean that a lot of the soil might fall out. I've also used a piece of wire just to sort of close up a slit if I had to slit it up the side, or to attach it so that it can't really move relative to the wood of the tree. And now I'm just going to fill them up with a propagation mix, which is 80% perlite and 20% coco coir, and then get them wet. All right, that's kind of messy, but you get the idea. So let me just recap here. I started by cleaning out the foliage so that I could really see the structure of the plant. Then I moved into kind of examining what parts of the plant I might want to layer off. And once I did that, I ended up removing a little bit more foliage to make space for these pots that I've attached. Those are just wired in place, but inside each one is a wire that's really tightly wound around the bark of the tree. And that's because separating the bark and the cambium with junipers doesn't seem to provide for a good air layer. They often die when you do that. So just girdling it, in other words, cinching down a piece of wire onto the branch, will force the photosynthesis and whatnot that's coming down from the foliage to pool up there, and that will cause it to issue roots. There's also these little bumps on the tree that seem to pretty readily issue roots. I guess you could call them dormant buds rather than bumps. And add a little bit of sphagnum moss to the pots once I had them secured in place in the bottom, and then filled them up with my propagation mix, which is 80% perlite and 20% coco coir. And now I'm going to set this in kind of a warm spot. That could be either outside or in my greenhouse. And I would expect that it's going to take the majority of the rest of this year. Maybe I'll check in on these in the fall to see if they've issued any roots. And meanwhile, I'll maybe do a whole nother batch of them. If you've had success with air layering junipers, leave some instructions in the comments below. If you want to pick up a juniper or two, we sell Kishu Junipers on Bonsaify.com. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.